Federal health officials consider it an epidemic, yet you rarely hear a thing about it. At first, it seemed to strike only one segment of the population. Now, Barry Peterson tells us this is no longer the case.
40 years ago this year, in 1981, the first cases of what would come to be known as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS, were clinically observed in the United States. Cases, who were often young, often otherwise healthy, developed opportunistic strains of pneumonia and a previously rare form of skin cancer known as Kaposi's sarcoma. In 1983, two separate research groups in the United States and France identified the cause of the disease as a novel retrovirus that would eventually be named the human immunodeficiency viruses, or HIV. The first identified cases of AIDS were primarily among gay men, and more were soon identified among intravenous drug users. And it is probably due to this that it was nicknamed gay cancer, moralized, and ignored by those with any power to do anything, even as cases skyrocketed from a few dozen to over 500,000 Americans, including children.
How to stop it from spreading.
I was born during the height of the AIDS crisis, and I started school around the same time the FDA approved the protease inhibitor that, in combination with other retrovirals, would finally start to bring about the decline in worldwide AIDS deaths. I mostly grew up in a post-AIDS America, and yet the echoes of treating AIDS as a moral instead of systemic failing were still felt even as late as my teens. From around about the time that I was in middle school, the prevailing theory amongst us prepubescent children was that AIDS had jumped from chimp to man, and as we understood it, HIV/AIDS was a sexually transmitted illness. Thereby, at some point, some pervert fucked a chimp. I'll admit that this was never a very convincing theory to me, even when I was, 12 and still entertaining the idea of Santa Claus being real. But, where does HIV/AIDS come from? I technically have a bachelor's degree, and I still don't know. So let's find out together. Early in the AIDS crisis, scientists noted a group of captive rhesus macaques suffering from similar symptoms to AIDS patients in the US. In 1985, shortly after the discovery of HIV-1, the cause of the simian illness was identified as SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus. The discovery of SIV actually led to the discovery of a new strain of HIV, HIV-2, that resembled its simian ancestor even more closely than its human cousin. The link between HIV and SIV is found in only one species of chimpanzee, Pan-troglodytes troglodytes, which can only be found in nature between the Sanaga River in southern Cameroon and the Congo. And no, it is highly unlikely that SIV jumped from chimp to human through some kind of perverted sex act. It is assumed that a few drops of infected Pan-troglodytes troglodytes blood entered the open wound of a hunter or butcher while they were hunting or butchering the animal. It is here, in Kinshasa, where strains of HIV virus were the most genetically diverse. In HIV-1, scientists have been able to identify 4 different genetic groups, M, N, O, and P, indicating that the virus has made the chimp-to-human jump at least 4 times. But Group M accounts for 99% of all HIV infections. HIV, for all the terror it has caused, is a fragile virus with a relatively low transmission rate, especially sexually. An infected person can have sex hundreds of times without transmitting the virus. A sizable viral load and fluid-to-blood contact are required to transmit HIV. This is also why some sex acts are higher risk than others. You're at a higher risk if you have any active sores, or if there's any tearing. Use lube, folks. So, here we have a problem. An isolated virus that replicates slowly. In order for HIV to spread at a rate that would result in one of the most dramatic pandemics in all of human history, it would need an amplifier, or several. Molecular clock dating shows that HIV-1 Group M most likely reached humans in 1921. So, what was going on in Kinshasa in 1921? Well, the region of the Congo River was, at the time, under French and Belgian colonial rule, and Kinshasa was not called Kinshasa, but Leopoldville, after Belgium's Leopold II, one of history's greatest monsters. Leopoldville was home to the Matadi-Kinshasa Railway, which linked the capital city to the port of Matadi, where the Congo River meets the Atlantic Ocean. The construction of the railway in the 1880s was so brutal that it resulted in the deaths of 1,932 people, 93% of which were Africans. And it earned itself a cameo in everyone's favorite book you only read the Spark Notes for in AP Lit, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. By the 20th century, French colonists in Leopoldville's neighboring city of Brazzaville were determined to build their own railway, parallel to the Matadi-Kinshasa line, so that they would no longer be dependent on the rival Belgians. Construction began on what would be known as the Congo Ocean Railway in 1921, using conscripted labor. The project was even more brutal than the Belgian line, resulting in the deaths of somewhere between 15,000 and 23,000 people. To quote epidemiologist Dr. Jacques Pepin in his book The Origins of AIDS, paid 1.5 francs per day, less than 1% of what their French foremen received, they worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Daily rations of food were inadequate, and the workers often received less than they were supposed to. They were housed in mud brick buildings where 50 to 60 men slept in the same room. Out of such brutal working conditions came two very obvious results. The Congo War Rebellion between 1928 and 1931, and lots of disease. Midway through the construction, a couple of French military doctors, General Lasnais and Lieutenant Colonel Ferris, traveled to the Congo to inspect the construction site. To their credit, they were horrified by what they saw, and their reports on the conditions of the worksite created a minor scandal back home in France. As a result, wages were increased and worker conditions were slightly improved, but two more things were introduced to the workers' camps in an effort to improve conditions: vaccination and prostitution. It is likely that one of the first amplifiers of HIV-1 was commercial sex work. And there had been some commercial sex work to an extent in West Africa at the time, in the form of the femmes libres, which were women who had escaped rural polygamy and kind of just served, 3 or 4 different clients and also did the cooking and cleaning and, the girlfriend experience. But in order to fight cases of what European doctors called physiological misery, sex workers were introduced to the workers' camps in the 1920s and 1930s to provide some comfort, some recreation, and as a result, sexually transmitted infections skyrocketed in the workers' camps. In 1931, the colonial surgeon and obstetrician in Brazzaville was a man named Léon Palais. Palais's thing was really autopsies, and luckily for him, in Brazzaville, he had a lot of free time to pursue his passions. A number of autopsies he performed around that time were of victims of an unknown wasting disease. Palais's notes on several of the autopsied victims indicated that they suffered from a cerebral atrophy and disease of the lymph nodes consistent with modern AIDS patients. It is quite possible that these were some of the disease's earliest victims. While commercial sex work certainly amplified the disease, sexual transmission alone is still fairly inefficient, and the epidemic probably would have remained contained in the French and Belgian Congo were it not for several early vaccination campaigns were waged in the regions of the French and Belgian Congo from the 1910s to the 1950s. Some of these efforts were well-meaning, European doctors doing their best to slow the epidemic waves of sleeping sickness and smallpox that regularly swept through the continent, and some of them could be characterized more as mercenary attempts by colonists with financial interests in the region trying to protect their assets, African laborers, and build herd immunity to protect the whites. But whether you were a humanitarian trying to save lives or a capitalist trying to protect capital, medical equipment, namely syringes, was in short supply. Syringes at the time were expensive, usually made of glass, so it was common practice to reuse them. Oh, yes. You know where this is going. In The Origin of AIDS, Pepin recalls using glass reusable syringes himself in the region as late as early 1980. By then, syringes were sterilized in an autoclave, but if the power went out, the nurses were forced to boil them, and, quote, I did not pay too much attention to how long they were boiled. He speculates that he may have inadvertently infected some of his patients with HIV. Studies of intravenous drug users with the HIV virus have shown that blood transmission is up to 10 times more efficient than sexual transmission of the disease. In the vaccination campaigns of the 1920s and 30s, it is likely that HIV had its first big chance. According to French records, in one campaign, they used 6 syringes to vaccinate 80,000 Africans! Among those vaccinated in one of these early campaigns was the person who had been initially exposed to HIV-1 group M, or someone close to them who had also been infected with that strain and group of virus. At long last, HIV was amplified due to early 20th century colonial practices, and would soon be given its own opportunity to colonize the earth. During the Second World War, the twin cities of Leopoldville and Brazzaville provided raw materials to the Allied forces. But following the Republic of Congo and Democratic Republic of Congo's declarations of independence in 1960, the whites fled the region in droves, causing sudden economic collapse in the two new nations. In an economic vacuum, brothels called flamingos started to pop up everywhere. Here, sex workers were forced to sleep with upwards of 1,000 clients a year, ensuring a fairly steady spread of HIV in the region. But, in the absence of European colonists, how did HIV become an international infection? Well, okay, this next part gets a little bit more speculative, but Pépin's research seems to back it up. So, HIV-1 group M can additionally be broken down into subgroups A through K. The subgroup that will eventually become most common in North America and Western Europe is subgroup B, which is actually kind of rare in Central Africa, but just put a pin in that for now. So, molecular clock dating indicates that HIV-1, Group M, Subgroup B arrived in Haiti sometime in 1966. So, how did it make the transatlantic jump? Well, another shitty practice of Belgian colonialism was denial of education or training. You know, it's a lot easier to maintain a heavily stratified society with a large population of hard laborers when you don't let the majority of the citizens attend school. So, by the time of independence, there were only about 30 Congolese people total who'd held any university degrees. The newly independent nations needed well-educated French speakers to fill a number of middle management positions, and Haiti, on the other side of the Atlantic, just happened to have a number of black, well-educated French speakers. The United Nations hired 4,500 Haitians to fill bureaucratic and teaching roles in the Congo. Okay, so as I said before, HIV-1, Group M, Subgroup B was fairly rare in the region. You had your pin in that? Okay, time to go ahead and take the pin out, take it down. Subgroup B only accounted for about 1% of Central African infections, which means, mathematically, HIV likely only crossed the Atlantic in one individual. With only one carrier, HIV in North America once again needed an amplifier to successfully propagate, and Haiti in the 1970s offered two: a bustling industry of gay sex tourism and an industrious plasma center in Port-au-Prince called Hemo-Caribbean that exported 1,600 gallons of blood plasma to the United States each month. By the 1980s, the earliest American cases of the subgroup B infections were identified in gay men and hemophiliacs, suggesting that the virus took both routes. The AIDS epidemic in the United States had finally begun. Okay, I am feeling 1970s. I'm gonna listen to an 8-track and adopt a pet rock. So 1970s America has been characterized as one of the most sexually decadent periods in human history since like the reign of Caligula. This was the era of disco and poppers, of bathhouses and Studio 54. Women were on the pill and the gays were fresh off a Stonewall, baby. A lot of gay activists from the time really relate to the intersection of sexual liberation and activism. You know, of the cruising scene as almost kind of an extension of activism. Sex as an act of rebellion, of pride. Sex was also a way for a lot of gay men to cope with the lifetimes of loneliness and isolation wrought by a society that had only just depathologized homosexuality as a mental illness. In the aptly named documentary Gay Sex in the 1970s, photographer Alvin Baltrop relates, "The most important thing is to make that contact. The sexual part was a large part of it, but it was more of not being alone. Having a certain energy, you want to get out there and meet somebody and be with somebody. That was a very, very important thing, so that you could call up somebody. Can I come over and see you?" It was sexual, the call, but it was also a statement. I don't want to be alone. Outside the safety of the scene, America was still a pretty scary place to be gay, even within the comparatively progressive urban city centers. But inside, it was a constant party. It wasn't uncommon to have sex with several different partners in a day, many of them strangers. There was no fear of pregnancy, and any STD you picked up along the way, syphilis, gonorrhea, could be treated with a pill. Many people reported having hundreds of sexual partners a year. I bring all of this up because I really want you to understand how normalized this was in the period between Stonewall and the AIDS outbreak, and because, well, we need to talk about Gaëtan Dugas. Gaëtan Dugas was the Québécois man now most famous for being AIDS patient zero in the United States. At the age of 22, Dugas was among Air Canada's first cohort of male flight attendants. He was unapologetically flamboyant, outgoing, and his hair was offensively beautiful. I mean, girl. Allegedly, he tailored his airline uniform to be skin tight and competed with his female coworkers to see who could pick up the hottest passengers aboard their flights. Friends recalled him being absolutely unashamed of being out and gay at a time when that was still remarkable in spite of the public gains that had been made by the liberation movement. A former colleague remembers him once telling her, "Someday I'll be a star." By the time the curtain dropped on the 1970s, Dugas was known as the flight attendant with a man in every port. In 1980, he was diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, a telltale symptom of AIDS. A study by the CDC by 1982 had identified 40 patients exhibiting symptoms of Kaposi's sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia in New York and California, 8 of whom had reported having had sexual contact with a flight attendant with a French accent. Dr. William Darrow of the CDC tracked down the mystery flight attendant. Gaëtan Dugas. Dugas was incredibly cooperative. Most gay men at the time were still nervous about talking to the feds, but Gaëtan spoke freely and even provided some diary entries about former sexual encounters. He told Dr. Darrow that he probably slept with around 250 partners a year, maybe around 750 in the previous 3 years, and he gave Dr. Darrow 72 names. Dr. Darrow designated Gaëtan patient 057, but when the CDC published the report in 1984, patient 057 was nicknamed Patient O for out of California. This was later misprinted in the press as Patient Zero. Okay, fast forward a few years to 1987. 24,559 people have already died of AIDS-related complications by the start of the year, and 16,290 more will die before the year is out. Randy Shilts is publishing his book, And the Band Played On: People, Politics, and the AIDS Epidemic. It's really one of the first pieces of long-form journalism about the crisis and will come to be known as one of the most enduring. It will certainly be Shilts's greatest legacy. But the press have no interest in covering it. So right away, there's this fear that these 4 years of research that Shilts has done on this important topic are just going to fizzle out into nothing. No one will read the work. Shilts's publisher, Michael Denneny, recalls a PR woman in tears over the whole thing. So, according to Denneny, he calls up an ex-boyfriend who just happens to be a publicist for some advice. And the publicist ex-boyfriend points to a paltry 11 pages in the work about Patient Zero, Gaëtan Dugas. He says, "Send those 11 pages to the New York Post." If you aren't familiar with the New York Post, how do I describe the New York Post? Yeah, so the New York Post loved the story and ran a headline about the gay foreigner who gave us all the plague, and a monster was born. Gaetan Dugas died in 1983 at the age of 32. He never lived to see the boogeyman he would become, thank God. And the band played on, went on to become a wild success, and got adapted for its own made-for-TV movie by HBO, and I am glad we have it. It's an important work in a lot of respects. However, it needlessly and incorrectly demonizes Dugas as this, like, sociopathic, cold-hearted, deliberate spreader of AIDS. And yes, Dugas no doubt played an unwitting role in spreading HIV. He did elect to continue having sex even after his diagnosis, which, as the kids say these days, is not a good look. But it was also early enough in the pandemic that there was no conclusive proof that AIDS was a sexually transmitted illness. A 2016 study found that HIV/AIDS had been in New York City since at least around 1971, before Dugas had even started working for Air Canada. And since 1983, we've also learned that the incubation period before AIDS symptoms start presenting is a lot longer than doctors had initially thought. Many of Dugas' sexual partners with AIDS probably had the illness for months or even years before even meeting the flight attendants. The patient zero myth really kind of re-victimized Dugas. In retrospect, his willingness to work with the CDC really saved lives. The CDC credited his testimony with helping them to confirm that the virus could be sexually transmitted. His cooperation was heroic, and the real tragedy, maybe even more so than his untimely death, is that he's remembered as a monster. There has been a movement to rehabilitate Dugas' image, including the 2019 film Killing Patient Zero, which I have been trying to see for months and cannot seem to find in the US. Even the official Facebook page for the documentary gave me bad info. Canada viewers, please come through for me. Send me your Crave logins. Dr. Robert M. Grant, an AIDS researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, has observed that the patient zero myth has done a lot of damage in the form of discouraging HIV testing, and he hopes that humanizing Gaetan Dugas will encourage people to get tested during epidemics. Quote, "No one wants to be the patient zero of their village, but this may be helpful because it says, just because you are the first to be diagnosed doesn't mean you started the epidemic." As a millennial, as one who can sort of remember AIDS, the boogeyman, from childhood, but since at least early adulthood on, mostly recognizes it as a thing we largely have under control now. The narrative I'd always internalized about the Reagan administration's response to the crisis was mostly one of bad optics. A lot of focus has been on condemning the fact that Reagan never said the word AIDS publicly until 1985, which, yeah, that's pretty damning, but it is just a word, right? Like, the narrative I'd always received was Ron and Nancy were pretty apathetic about the gay disease until their friend Rock Hudson announced his diagnosis, and suddenly they cared because it affected them personally. Which, yeah, makes them look pretty shitty, but it's a narrative that it just kind of tracks with celebrity culture, right? The problem isn't a problem until it affects me is not a mindset that demarcates Ronald Reagan from other public figures. All this talk of apathy is making me want to take a little movie break. Let's just take a little look-see at my box of VHS. Bad history. Bats and men? I don't think so. This is dumb. Why am I doing this? Star Wars. Sounds more like some Star Boars. Like boring, not like boars, like 30 to 50 in your front yard. Oh, hang on. What's this? It says, the expansion of AIDS was the direct result of a campaign of willful obstruction? Well, I guess we'll have to watch. Many men in the San Francisco and New York metropolitan areas start coming down with a bizarre wasting illness. The San Francisco Department of Health has one of the more immediate and commendable responses. They do some contact tracing and suggest that the disease may be sexually transmitted. The department issues recommendations to gay men to stop having sex. This does not go over well with the gay men of San Francisco, who came to the Bay Area to escape discrimination in the first place. Members of the New York City and San Francisco gay communities take to the streets to raise money and spread awareness in the face of bureaucratic apathy. Rifts break out within the community between those who believe the illness might be sexually transmitted and therefore the bathhouses should be closed, and those who think that closing the bars and bathhouses is tantamount to climbing back into the closet. At the start of the year, there are 337 reported cases of AIDS. By the year end, that number will more than double, and there will be 488 new deaths. As early as 1982, AIDS is detected in the supply of America's blood banks. There is no action from leadership to screen blood or even acknowledgement that AIDS could be transmitted through blood transfusions, despite a spike in cases among hemophiliacs.
A new development in the Tylenol murder case.
In October, 7 people die after ingesting cyanide-laced Tylenol capsules. The New York Times runs a front-page story about the Tylenol murders every single day of October and 33 additional stories after that. By contrast, they run 3 stories about AIDS in all of 1982, none of which are on the front page. Over 100 law enforcement agencies and over 1,000 FDA employees work on the Tylenol case. Johnson & Johnson report that they spend $100 million on the case, and the way products are sold in stores is changed to this day. The Reagan administration publicly called AIDS a #1 health priority, but refused to provide the CDC with any additional funding. San Francisco Chronicle journalist Randy Shilts attends an awards ceremony where he is to be given a commendation for his coverage on AIDS. Television announcer Bill Curtis gives the keynote address and jokes, "What's the hardest part about having AIDS? Trying to convince your wife that you're Haitian." Shilts, infuriated, decides then and there to write the book that will become And the Band Played On, Politics, People, and the AIDS Epidemic. In it, he points out that the National Institutes of Health spent $34,841 per death of Legionnaire's disease after it killed 29 people in 1977. By contrast, the NIH had only spent $3,225 in 1981 and about $8,991 in 1982 for each person who died of AIDS. The CDC issues a warning to blood banks that HIV is likely in the blood supply. There is still no action from leadership in America's blood banks. The death count is up to 2,118. President Ronald Reagan says the word AIDS publicly for the first time. When he refers to the disease, it is mostly to resist calls for more funding to study and fight it. A Los Angeles Times poll found that 51% of respondents supported quarantining people with AIDS and criminalizing sex between a person with an AIDS diagnosis and another person, while 48% supported identification cards for anyone who tested positive for AIDS antibodies. The federal government licenses an HIV antibody test. Blood banks finally start testing donations for HIV.
Ryan White says he gets very lonely. He misses his friends.
The 13-year-old was
Ryan White, a 13-year-old hemophiliac who'd been infected with HIV during a routine blood transfusion, is banned from attending school in Indiana, despite the CDC and Indiana State Health Commissioner both notifying the school board that the boy posed no risk. When asked, Reagan echoes the concerns of the school board. The first International AIDS Conference is held in Atlanta. It has been 5 years since the outbreak started in the U.S. AIDS is now reported in 51 countries and on every continent except for Antarctica. The U.S. Center for Disease Control reports that more people were diagnosed with AIDS in 1985 than in all earlier years combined. The 1985 figures show an 89% increase in new AIDS cases compared with 1984. 12,529 people have died. Of all AIDS cases to date, 51% of adults and 59% of children have died. Public health experts predict twice as many new AIDS cases in 1986. New cases will nearly double again in 1987. The FDA approves the first drug to treat AIDS, zidovudine or AZT. AZT comes with a number of dangerous side effects, and a 1-year supply costs patients $10,000 in 1980s money annually, keeping the drug out of reach for many suffering with AIDS. The FDA and NIH are not, at this time, openly exploring other options. In New York City, Larry Kramer founds ACT UP, an AIDS activism and direct action group, in order to put pressure on government officials, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical companies. In interviews, Kramer observes that this is the first time in history that the victims of a plague, the sick people themselves, have had to advocate for themselves in the face of inaction. U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop calls for a comprehensive program of sex and AIDS education. His report calls for sex education programs in schools, increased condom use, and voluntary testing. This seems to cause some friction with President Ronald Reagan, whose administration advocates for personal abstinence, abstinence-based education in schools, and a limited government response. Quote, I think that particular subject should be taught in connection with values, not simply taught as a physical, mechanical process. The federal role must be to give educators accurate information about the disease. How that information is used must be up to schools and parents, not government. But let's be honest with ourselves. AIDS information cannot be what some call value neutral. After all, when it comes to preventing AIDS, don't medicine and morality teach the same lessons? In October of 1987, the Senate approves Senator Jesse Helms' amendment to the fiscal 1988 appropriations bill for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education, prohibiting the CDC from funding AIDS programs that, quote, promote homosexual activities. In Helms' own words, we have got to call a spade, and a perverted human being a perverted human being. 40,849 people are dead.
You know what? We get it. I can stop this now. The legacy of AIDS in America is one of systemic feet-dragging and willful incompetence from the federal government, from private healthcare and insurance companies, even from charities like national blood centers. And it's no coincidence that the earliest communities suffering from AIDS were gay, racial minorities, people suffering from addictions. These were communities that you didn't have to care about. People made jokes about AIDS, and those with any power chose to ignore or deprioritize it until it started spilling over into the communities that they actually gave a shit about. By 1994, AIDS was the leading cause of death for Americans aged 25 to 44. Let me repeat that for you. The leading cause of death for all Americans aged 25 to 44. It wasn't even until the mid-90s that the combination therapies were approved that would finally start to level off the fatalities after 15 years of fear and death. Today, HIV infections can be pretty well managed with the combination therapies available. Someone who has been on retrovirals for long enough will have amounts of the HIV virus present in their bloodstream that are virtually undetectable to a test, which has given rise to the phrase undetectable is untransmittable. People with HIV can live normal, healthy lives and safely be sexually active with HIV-negative partners as long as they are on treatment. But in the United States, where combination therapies can cost anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 a month, some patients still struggle to get the drugs they need. There are some federal programs for the uninsured, but some patients have reported that the monthly income requirements are too low. Some patients receiving federal assistance have reported having to refuse extra hours at work in order to not get kicked off of assistance. In his 2013 documentary, Fire in the Blood, Dylan Mohan Gray chronicles efforts by activists in the Global South fighting the pharmaceutical patent monopolies that still keep AIDS medications out of the hands of people who need them to this day. In Africa, where HIV has been infecting people for 100 years now, the only treatment is in the form of brand-name retrovirals for $40 a pill. And pharmaceutical companies like GlaxoSmithKline have spent the last 40 years lobbying to prevent the sale of generic AIDS medications. And for the record, that $40 a pill price point isn't just because that's how much it costs to manufacture or to turn a profit. Generic forms of the same drugs in Thailand, where generics are permissible, turn a profit at only 5 cents a pill. Nor is it the invisible hand of the free market just determining that's what people will pay for it. GSK and other pharmaceutical companies do not do good business on the African continent. Outside of a few isolated markets, they just don't make any sales at all. They know that they could move product and still turn a profit if they offered generic forms of the medications. They have decided that they would rather withhold than take on the financial risk of more generic forms flooding the market. Such decisions may be economic in theory. However, in countries where the average monthly wage is only $250, they are ideological in practice. This is a multinational corporation saying, those people, these people over here, they should not have access to life-saving medication. I've changed clothes. I'm no longer dressed like the point of view character I established at the beginning of the video because I'm filming the conclusion on a different day. I've also already returned all of the 80s props that I borrowed for mise-en-scene. I hope this view behind the curtain doesn't spoil the magic for you. So, to look at the history of AIDS is to see a narrative emerge. One of colonists who, in pursuit of economic interests, allowed an isolated infection to become an epidemic, of pharmaceutical corporations in the global north, themselves the inheritors of the colonialism that allowed the virus to take hold in the first place, withholding life-saving treatment from patients in the global south. Of a government scapegoating a vulnerable minority to avoid having to take any responsibility for or action in an epidemic that had become a pandemic, and of a publisher scapegoating an individual in order to sell more books. AIDS was not an inevitability, and its more than 32 million victims did not have to lose their lives. The propagation of HIV was not the result of individual irresponsibility on a mass scale, but of systemic negligence bordering on outright malice. And this narrative does not exist in a vacuum. We are now entering the second year of a new worldwide pandemic, one with a much lower death rate than AIDS, but one that is so highly infectious that in the United States it is projected to kill more Americans by February than HIV killed in its first 20 years here. There's an idiom that people like to throw around a lot. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, or something to that effect. And while I definitely think that there's some value to that wisdom, I don't really consider it like a hard and fast rule. I don't think it's like broadly applicable to all world events. But there is another idiom that I like a lot more. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And when I cast about me for wise words in troubling times and read phrases like China virus and bat soup and too little too late, in my mind echoes their rhyming couplets. Gay cancer and chimp fucker and too little too late.